You may be seated. In his poem, Every Riven Thing, writer and poet Christian Wyman speaks of God's permeating presence. And so this morning, I invite you to take a breath and maybe to close your eyes, to settle in and to hear and to see these words that Wyman writes. God goes belonging to every riven thing God's made, singing his being simply by being the thing it is. The stone and tree and sky, the man who sees and sings and wonders why, God goes. Belonging to every riven thing he's made means a storm of peace. Think of the atoms inside the stone. Think of the man who sits alone, trying to will himself into a stillness where God goes belonging. To every riven thing he's made, there is given one shade, shaped exactly to the thing itself. Under the tree, a darker tree, under the man, the only man to see, God goes belonging to every riven thing. He's made the thing that brings him near, made the mind that makes him go, a part of what man knows, apart from what man knows. God goes belonging to every riven thing he's made. God goes belonging, friends, to every riven thing that God has made. And in our passage that Norm is about to read from Romans today, we hear of that belonging, God's being tied into creation, God being seen and shining through the things that God's made, from rocks and trees to you and me. But creation is not only an act of physical dimension, of hard concrete objects, but our lives too are an act of creation. And I wonder if here too we can see God shining through, for God goes belonging to every riven thing.
A reading from Romans. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, God's eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things God has made. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. Amen.
Amen. Would you please pray with me? Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be glorified in your sight. For you, O God, God from the very beginning, God who is the Alpha and the Omega, God who is the great Creator. You are our rock, and you are our Redeemer. Amen. The scene opens as the sun rises. You see many little feet tucked into a simple straw bed. Crumbs litter the floor, cockroaches scurry by. Yelling comes, maybe from outside or maybe from down the hall, and the family begins to stir. Fanny Price is a girl of lowly means, her mother marrying a poor man for love. Their home is filled with the laughter of little ones, and their home is filled with the hardness that poverty often brings. As a child, Fanny is sent to her mother's sister and her family. See, unlike her mother, Fanny's aunt married for wealth. And so her family resides at Mansfield Park, an enormous estate. And it is here where Fanny grows up, asking questions about money and power and privilege, and about how the choices of our lives change us. In a 1990s film interpretation of Jane Austen's novel, Mansfield Park, the movie closes with you, the viewer, going character to character, and seeing the places that life has taken them, and you hear Fanny's voice. It could have all turned out differently, I suppose, but it didn't. And our lives too. Our lives too could have turned out differently, I suppose, but they didn't. Our lives are made of moments and choices, experiences and relationships and places. They could have gone a million different ways, but they didn't. In crowdsourcing for this sermon, I threw out the question, because for each of us it's different. What has created or shaped or molded your life? And people shared specifics. They shared moments that changed everything. One woman from our church shared how when she was a young girl, when she and her father were home alone, she came across his body, and he had died, and nothing was the same ever again. Members shared stories of being adopted, of birth mothers making seemingly impossible decisions to make a life better for their little ones, and the ways that those choices continue to echo as these members now themselves are mothers. People shared about Kennedy being shot and the Twin Towers falling, of large events that shake our innocence and assumed sense of security. There are moments in our lives where we become aware outside of ourselves, when our privilege is recognized, and members wrote of these times. They wrote of eyes and hearts being opened to poverty and injustice in America, as they helped in soup kitchens in D.C. and built homes in rural Maine. And those experiences years ago with their own high school youth groups, how they ignited a flame that continues to burn in them these years later and calls them to still ask, how can I serve my neighbor and how can I create a different world? People shared of surviving years of pain, of hard homes where hearts too could have become hard, but instead how those dark years made the life and light to come that much brighter. People shared these specifics, but they also shared broad strokes. One member wrote, intentional and not intentional happenings, mistakes to the miracles and all the in-betweens are what made her life. Or another, oh, so many births and deaths and loves, friendships and shared experiences. They've shaped who I am and continue to shape who I am becoming. And the good and the bad and the joy and the heartbreaks are all worth it. You, each of you here today, have these stories. These big moments that shake and shape, and these little seemingly inconsequential choices that mold and make us who we are. Chapters begin and chapters end. Every year, when invited to high school graduation parties, I wrap a tiny book that shaped and changed my life, given to me by my beloved college chaplain, Dr. Clapp. It was this book that made me ask, what kind of life do I want to live? It is this book that I come back to time and again like some touch point. It's a book that I have dog-eared and marked its pages. And in the book, Let Your Life Speak by Parker Palmer, he writes, I must listen to my life telling me who I am. Who is our life telling us that we are? How are our choices to stay or to move on, to love and to let go, telling us about who we are in the world? I wonder when we listen and reflect on our life as a teacher with lessons to learn and things to tell us, when we reflect on our life as a teacher, I wonder what this also says about God, God who is part of every riven thing. Christian Wyman, that poet author, has not had an uncomplicated life. Living with terminal cancer, Christian wrote his book, My Bright Abyss, about finding faith and God in the midst of facing death. And yet, in his poem, he points to a God that is in all things. Not some puppeteer or master manipulator, but a God who is intimately part of creation. And so I'm left with a question of how do we live a good life? How do we create a good life? It's interesting. It's a common question nowadays, but it's one that didn't evolve until around the time of the Industrial Revolution, as mechanization and urbanization moved society from countries to cities, from farms to factories, as some gained resources and wealth that was never before imaginable. We began to wonder, what is the point of it all? We see this reflected in Kierkegaard and Tolstoy and Schopenhauer. We see this question in the beloved Mary Oliver, who asks, what are you going to do with your one wild and precious life? There's even been a modern trend in Ivy League academia, an attempt to answer this question, how do we live and what's a good life? At Yale, there's a popular course with that very title, The Good Life, where psychology and theology meet. At Stanford, they're calling it the Design Lab, inviting students and those willing to pay a fee how they want to use design principles to create their lives. But I wonder if these practices were merely reimagining something that St. Ignatius of Loyola and early Christians regularly practiced. When asked what created your life, one member told me of a little slice of heaven built on an island in Lake Huron. I'm sure some of you have your little own slice of heaven. This member wrote of going as a child and now taking her children. She wrote of a time out on the lake with her mother and the laughter of cousins. And I wonder if in part what she loves about the lake is that what is important there in that house built by her grandfather are the things that are truly important. Today, when you received your bulletin, you also received this paper, jokingly calling it your homework. But this paper is an interpretation of St. Ignatius of Loyola's practice called the examen. As Socrates said, the unexamined life, after all, isn't worth living. The examen will invite you to take time to reflect on 7 areas of your life. It'll invite you to reflect on your spirit, on your body, on your mind, on your relationships, on your home, on your work, and on your resources. And it'll ask you to ask the questions. It'll ask you to reflect on what has happened in the last week, and it'll invite you to reset with a sense of intentionality for the week ahead. Because friends, how do we let our lives speak? How do we let our lives tell us and teach us? And how do we recognize God's movement amidst it all? This week, I invite you to take this examen, this practice home. For some of you, maybe it's something you will never try or do again, but for some of you, maybe it's a way to feel God's Spirit and God's presence. I invite you to take this practice home, and maybe you'll light a candle and make a cup of tea. Maybe you'll sit with it in bed moments before you fall asleep. Or maybe you'll lock yourself in your bathroom for a few blessed moments of quiet amidst the busyness of it all. But all of these are sacred places too. Maybe you find yourself in the midst of a season in your life where you're staying the course. Maybe you're in a place where God is calling you to shake things up and to try something new. I invite you to take time and think about how you and God together are creating a life. What is thriving? What is making you joyful and your heart sing? And where do you want to reset? Where have you stopped listening to the ways God's Spirit is living in you? Meeting with a member this week, this member shared that every day he asks God, "What is your plan for today?" And then he prays, "God, help me to be open to you." Starting a sermon series on creation, so often we think of creation as something separate or apart from our humanity. Like nature is out there and we, sitting here, are the civilized and the settled. Or that we can talk of creation only when we talk about starry nights or melting ice caps. But this false dichotomy does nothing but distance us, for we are a part of creation. Our lives are an act of creation. And the ways that we live matter. What would happen if we treated our lives as if God was truly a part of every riven thing? What would it mean to create that life? There is no one size fits all. But maybe this week, maybe just for a week, we reflect and reset. May we let go so that something new can be born. May we notice the small, seemingly inconsequential moments shaping us. And may we live our lives. May we live our lives on purpose, with a sense of intentionality. For what are we going to do with this one wild and precious life? Amen.